Welcome to ClueCon Weekly. Join us every Wednesday to learn about the latest cutting-edge developments in the real-time communications industry. ClueCon Weekly is brought to you by FreeSWITCH Solutions. Get support and professional services directly from the creators of the FreeSWITCH open source project, solving your issues in the most efficient, stable, and scalable way possible. Get the FreeSWITCH advantage. Visit freeswitch.com. Also brought to you by ClueCon, the premier technology conference for developers by developers. Join us every summer in Chicago. ClueCon kicks off on Monday with our annual hackathon, The Coder Games, followed by 3 days of technology-rich presentations discussing telecom, WebRTC, and IoT from developers around the world. To learn more, visit ClueCon.com or call 877-74-A-CLUE.
And welcome to ClueCon Weekly. Today is the 2nd of January, 2019. Brand new year for everybody. And so we've got a big edition of Community Corner this week. Mr. Mike Jarris will be joining us for that later with Mr. Malbrutus. Before we get to that, let's go over and see Miss Abby for the news. How's your new year going, Miss Abby?
Oh, it's going wonderful. Thank you for asking. Hi, everybody, and once again, welcome to ClueCon Weekly. This is our very first episode of 2019, and we're going to make it a very special one, and you can help by asking us some community corner questions on our brand new Slack channel. So if there's a question you've been dying to ask, tag one of us in the Slack channel, and we will answer it live during this show. My favorite announcement, as always, is save the date for ClueCon this year. It is our 15th anniversary and things are starting to heat up. So we're back to our regular dates, August 5th through August 8th, and we're back at the Swiss Hotel in Chicago. So make sure you put that in your calendar. Don't book anything else. And we're starting to get more announcements about what's going to be happening at ClueCon. So we've mentioned the Voicetel boat tour that we're going to be having on Thursday, and it's always a very big hit, so I really suggest staying until the end of the week for that. And once again, this year we're going to be having a big dinner party. That makes it sound way fancier than it is. We're all going to the Last Resort in Chicago. That is sponsored by FlowRoute, and it is a lot of fun. The waiters are hilarious, the food is good, and it's always a good time to meet people since it's the first day of the conference. So I'm very excited about that. Last year, it was the first time we ever did it, and it was a big hit. So thankfully, FlowRoute is going to be sponsoring that again. If you are interested in sponsoring an event at ClueCon, it's a great way to get your name out there. It's a great way to give back to the community. Email Sharon at freeswitch.com. In other news, you can catch us in Florida at the end of the month. We, the FreeSWITCH team, are going to be going to IT Expo, and while we're there, we're offering a live FreeSWITCH training. So that's a really good opportunity. So if you're interested in a live FreeSWITCH training, you can catch us in Florida at IT Expo. So our training is January 30th. That's a Wednesday, January 30th, from 9:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And then we're going to be there all the way through February 1st. Our booth is 1002. So come visit us at our booth through February 1st to win a signed copy of a FreeSWITCH book. Maybe if you're lucky. But if you visit us at our booth, your chances will go up. If you haven't heard, I've mentioned it 1,000 times before. We are on Slack now, just making sure that everybody knows because our community is very important to us and we want to make sure that we can communicate with you. So our HIP chat channels are closed, but we are now back on Slack. And if you prefer IRC and the mailing list, we will be there forever. So you can still communicate to us through there. Of course, if you have any questions during this call, you can also comment in the YouTube channel, the IRC channel, and the Slack channel, and we will answer those live. That's all the announcements I have for 2019. I hope everyone had an amazing holiday season, and I wish everybody the best in 2019. All right, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Abby. We're going to jump over to Mr. Michael Malbrutus and Mr. Mike Jarris. How you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Good. Happy New Year, everybody.
You too.
So today we have a bunch of questions for you, Mike.
Awesome.
You ready?
We will see, I guess.
All right, so they come across a lot of different mediums. So we have IRC, we have HipChat, and the mailing list. And so let's start with number one.
Great.
Okay, number one is from Nikolai Alexandrov, and he asks, how can I set UUID record API call to be executed on answer, and then later clear this action based on some logic?
Okay, so UUID record is an API command. Executing something on answer just conceptually isn't going to be an API command. It's going to be an application you're going to want to run. More likely you're going to want to run the record app or probably the session record session app on answer. So the way you would do something like that would be an execute on answer variable set to the appropriate app. The main thing to understand here is the difference between what an API command is and what an application is. An application runs as the session, where an API command is just kind of an arbitrary command that can be run even from the CLI. There's frequently UUID underscore versions of API commands, which will do the same sorts of things that run an application is, but they're actually very different things. UUID record can be run on any UUID in the system. Executing on answer says you want to run it on a specific session. They're kind of different contexts there. So you want to do execute on answer variable. Take a look at that. That will run an application when the call is answered in the record and record session applications.
Right, and so when you talk about application, you're just talking about just simply having a static XML dial plan entry, right?
So yeah, in an XML dial plan entry, one of those lines would be an application.
So why would we even use an API call here?
You wouldn't. That's the best answer.
This is straightforward. Don't use the API call.
Yeah. There's probably ways to call API commands at that point. In this case, it just doesn't make any sense.
Okay. So
Awesome. One down.
don't use the API. Number two, this one comes from IRC from Manning, and he asks, how can I run a condition on a channel variable that I've set? So this one's been asked before.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a chicken or an egg situation. The way dial plan works is we parse all of the conditions, and then we parse based on which actions are correct, which conditions are matched. We get a list of actions, and we set those list of actions on the channel, and then we run those actions. So this is a tricky one. So there's a feature called inline, and if you add an inline equals true to your dial plan, instead of running those after we've created the full list of actions, it'll run that kind of real time as the dial plan's being parsed. So you can do an inline for a set variable. So if your dial plan instruction in such a way that the condition would be run after it parses the first one that is set to inline, you can do it that way. Otherwise, you have to go through and do kind of two sections of dial plan. One that sets all the variables you're talking about, and then transfer, so you go back into the dial plan to actually run the conditions on that. Really depends on kind of the structure of your dial plan. If it gets too complicated, our dial plans aren't really meant to be a programming language with lots of branching logic and kind of to be run procedurally. That's what the embedded languages are for. So
And all the embedded languages are essentially inline.
Those, well, I mean, they run as applications, so they're gonna. It's not during the kind of routing state where you're in dial plan. It's just not a dial plan at that point. It is an application, and it can run kind of procedurally if that's the way your logic needs to work. You can also do something such as have the first stage of your dial plan run a script that does a bunch of logic, and then transfer back into dial plan and make a final decision that's a more static thing. When things get complicated like that, what I generally do is use XML curl and offload that logic offsite, so that all of those complicated decision making you can do in your PHP script or whatever language of choice you have, and you just return a static set of actions. Sometimes taking that logic out of the switch is a better choice and works better for things like scaling down the road.
So why don't you explain how the XML parser works? Because that kind of ties into why we need inline, right?
What are you getting at? What are you looking for as far as how that works? Are you talking about how the XML dial plan works, or?
No, so like how the dial plan's computed at startup and then kept in memory and is in the file and.
Got it. So the static dial plan or the static XML config in general gets parsed at startup. This includes dial plan, all the different sections,
and it sits in memory.
And then it sits kind of in a parsed XML state in memory until something tells it to refresh. So some of the reload module commands will do that. You can reload XML will do that. But basically, you're sitting there with parse XML in memory, and then when we go to do a dial plan lookup, if we're not using one of the dynamic modules like mod.xml curl, we're just going to dig into that XML registry, say, okay, here's the dial plan section, and it's going to go through and parse through all the conditions to find the things that it's even trying to do. The dial plan concept is very simple. It's not, it doesn't include all of those kind of programmatic branching methods. We have this clear state machine where we have a routing state, and during routing state, we parse conditions and get a list of things to run. And then we leave dial plan after we have a list of things to run, and we go into execute state, and it goes through and runs those applications. So that's what I was talking about, a little bit of a chicken or an egg situation is, by the time you're running those applications, dial plans, you're not in the dial plan code anymore. You have a list of applications to run, and you're running them. So the only way to get back in is to use transfer application to go back to routing state after the fact.
Okay, and so the application, which application languages you recommend, like JavaScript, Lua?
It's a very personal question. I think functionality-wise, Lua's really nice. We generally recommend using Lua. Personally, I can't stand Lua's syntax, but other people love Lua's syntax. It's generally what we recommend. Probably the lightest weight one out there. It's a really good utility language, and people like it. JavaScript's a little bit heavier. I lean more towards JavaScript or taking it outside of the switch altogether and doing, instead of an inline language, using something like mod.xml curl.
Cool.
Awesome.
Okay. So the next question is also from IRC, from ROR Dave. When I do video recording, the recording has a blue color background color. How can I eliminate that?
There is a bug open, and I have a fix for this, and I will get this into tree today. That's an easy one.
What was the bug? It had something to do with like pixel shifting or something like that, right?
There is a bug in mod AV format, specifically related to color spaces.
Okay.
And it's really strange. It only happens on some machines. And I'm not actually entirely sure why it only happens on some machines, but the color space in the recording isn't set properly sometimes. So you end up with this weird color shifting, and I believe that is
Is it
what you're
like
talking
when you mean some machines, you mean like versions of the library? Because that's like one that's different on every
No,
distribution.
no, not even versions of the library, like literally some different computers. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, no,
that must have been a tough one to
that was a
possibly
fun one
bug.
to track down. We did track it down recently, and I will get that picked back into the right branches. That was one we just tracked down recently, and we're gonna get that out there.
Okay, so when invoking, oh, this is from C888, and they ask on IRC, when invoking TX facts from CLI, how do you capture the status result?
So back to API commands versus apps. TX Facts is an application. It runs on a channel. It is not an API command. So I guess we got to kind of figure out what exactly they're getting at here. Ways you could invoke TX Facts from an API command would be to run originate, which would make a call. So, like saying you just want to send a fax. So you would make a call with the originate API command and send it to the TX Fax application. All of the answers of about how you would get the status results are going to be the same. TX Fax sets some variables on the channel. So you would look at those probably in the CDR would be the easiest way to look at those. After the fact, you're not going to easily see those on the CLI unless you're looking through logs. You could also,
Yeah, well, that's actually that's interesting. So just set the log level pretty high, and you could watch it.
you could watch it, but I don't think that's what they're looking for. I think the easiest way to do that would be to look at the variables in the CDR after the fact. If you're trying to like automated process how to tell those.
So if we're
Um,
gonna do an originate, we're gonna get basically like a UUID and an OK, right?
yeah. So yeah, it depends on how you need to track those. You can also in the originate set the origination UUID if you want to use that to track after the fact. You could, if you wanted to like do something with those variables after the fact, you could use an API hangup hook variable to do something with the channel as it's hanging up to paste those. We generally don't recommend doing that. But for like CDR type things, but it may be appropriate here. That's someplace you would have access to those variables as well. That's probably the last chance you'd have access to those variables kind of interactively.
So when we're talking about like APIs and then the BGs, you want to explain that? Because it would be harder to get, the statuses with BG, right? Like the background.
It would not be if you set the origination UUID.
And then you just track the UUID.
Yeah, you track it off of that.
That's
But
cool.
without that, yeah, I mean, either way, it's going to be problematic. You're not going to, until you know what the UUID is, it's tricky to track that down.
Okay, next question.
What do we got?
YayPal asks, how can I integrate FreeSWITCH with a CRM?
How can you integrate FreeSWITCH with the CRM? How would you
That's a
like
good
to
question,
integrate
isn't it?
FreeSWITCH with CRM? Yeah, there's I mean, one of the great things about FreeSWITCH is the hundreds and hundreds of different things you can do with it. So we have lots of different integration points, some of which we've already talked about today. We have the FreeSWITCH API interface, which lets you kind of run commands, and those commands can be run over something called ESL or Mod Event Socket. We have whole sets of libraries designed around pushing through things through Mod Event Socket, and that would be like the entire list of API commands. And then Event Socket has more features where you can like broadcast, run applications on park channels and things like that.
And
So
there's a lot of secondary open source packages that kind of, rotate around this, sitting on Event Socket and, you know,
absolutely dozens, at least different support for Event Socket in different languages are out there. I know there's like a Golang Event Socket library. Tons of these things that other people have written and maintained. Some of them good, some of them bad. But I've heard good things about the Go one, and I've heard a lot of people recently using that and having good results. So the Event Socket is one route for integrating to do anything. Another one we talked about is any of the dynamic config approaches. So ModXML curl is kind of our go-to. But there's different options out there, including embedded languages. Some of them have config hooks, like ModXML curl can, or I'm sorry, Modlua can do config hooks as well. And I think JavaScript, Mod V8 can do config hooks as well. Being able to dynamically handle config is a very powerful way to do integration. All depends on how tight you want to integrate and what exactly you want to do. If all you want to do is click to call and click to call status, then probably Event Socket's your best choice. If you want a full call center with screen pops and all that sort of integration, it's going to be a much more managed implementation that's going to involve dynamic config and DSL and other things. So it's a big topic, and the answer is start to look at the different customized ways. Look at FreeSWITCH API commands, look at dynamic config, look at embedded languages, look at Event Socket. All of those are great ways to integrate and do powerful things with FreeSWITCH.
so like mod curl XML, basically with that, we're just on the other end, like you said earlier, we're generating with like Nginx or Apache and like PHP or something like that, or even just pulling static files, right?
Yeah, mod XML curl is just, it makes a request. Depends on what you bind to. We can do it for configuration or dial plan or user directory. But let's say it's dial plan. We're going to send you all of the information about the call in the request, and you're going to return a dial plan. It could have conditions in it, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you already know about this call. So usually you just have like a blank set of conditions and all of the actions already listed straight out for that actual call. So what's on the back end of that? Something that can respond to a web response that does something. So yeah, that could be Apache and PHP. That could be a Go web server that does, that's its own web server and
Generates XML.
all that. And there's 100 ways you can handle that problem.
So, but getting to the languages, so we can set variables based on sessions, right? Or we can basically just send everything as URL. What is it? XML string, right?
You're talking about like the dynamic config from embedded languages?
Yeah.
Yeah, they typically you set an XML string inside of. So you set a chunk of code to run for that callback when you configure it. Like you configure which script to run, and you set an XML string inside of that script, and that's what gets processed on the other side.
Cool. All right, next question.
Awesome.
Oh, I'm gonna have a problem with this name. Timur Kajula. Any reason why FreeSWITCH does not mix original conversation audio and displaced audio file on UUID displace?
All right, so I am looking on Confluence on the mod commands page, has the documentation for UUID displace, and the last optional argument for UUID displace is MUX, M-U-X. That will mix the original audio together with the file. So I believe that is what you're missing.
So what does UUID displace actually do?
What does UUID displace do? So it's UUID displace, a UUID, start or stop, a file name, and then you can set a time limit, and then you can set MUX. So basically what it does is it replaces the audio going to whatever UUID you put there with that sound file. So the name displace is literally like we are going to replace that,
So you can have a lot of fun with this, right?
Yeah, and with the MUX option, you can do things like whisper into someone's ear on top of our conversation. So yeah, you could. It's definitely a great tool for pranks, but also useful for like actual whisper type notes. Like it's not like a call center coaching whisper feature. We do have one of those, but it could be used for appointment reminders or an in-audio notification of another call coming in or anything like that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Huh. I never thought of that. Okay. Next question. So Sandro Bordencini, just a random question about gateways. I have seen they can be configured with register equals true. In this case, FreeSWITCH registers against the gateway, or with register equals false, a direct link without any kind of regis. Is it possible to make the gateway register against FreeSWITCH? What would be good for PSTN gateways in a customer behind NAT and FreeSWITCH in a cloud environment?
All right. So gateways are all about us making calls out to like a registered provider. Gateways are like a path to a provider, or calls coming back in from our registration. So it's all about the connection to the provider. When FreeSWITCH is the provider, it's not a gateway at that point. That's just a user. So when you're on the other side of it, this is just regular SIP authentication for a user, and we can accept an inbound registration, and store that registration based on the user credentials.
So where can we define gateways?
Gateways are defined in the Sophia configuration.
Yes, but so like it's in the dial. You could set it on the dial, or we could set it in the directory, or we can set it like
Uh,
on the gateway or on the profile.
yeah, you can set them in the directory. Typically, I haven't done that in forever. I wonder if that still works. Typically, we set those right in configuration inside of the profiles in the Sophia config. But the users, like for registering to FreeSWITCH, that's just normal user credentials. Those are configured in the directory.
And so explain the difference between the two.
Between the different sections of config.
Or even like for defined gateways, like so we can set out a call via the gateway name, or we can set it out via the profile.
I'm not following. The users are purely configured in the directory. When you're sending a call out, you can reference like those gateways from dial plan. Is that where you're going with that question?
Yep.
Yeah. So the gateways are configured in the configuration section with your profiles, but the way you would reference those would be in dial plan, where you do Sophia in build out your dial string with the gateway reference there to make the call out the gateway.
And so what's the best what's the best way to do that? Is it all the same? Is one more efficient than the other?
I think there's really only one. I mean, you're just building out a dial string. Can't think of multiple ways to do that.
So what else should we be cognizant of with gateways?
What other things should we be cognizant of gateways? Inbound calls that are kind of tied to a registration in a gateway can be a little bit weird. People expect us to, like, the stats for the gateway to always match every inbound call that comes in. There are lots of ways outside of our control that can make us not understand that an inbound call is coming based on a registration. When we send out our registrations, we put a bunch of information in that registration that we can catch on the inbound call, including extra parameters we add into the contact and stuff like that. There's lots of things out there that ignore that and don't send that back like they're required to by the RFC. And when I say lots, probably more than 50% of the things out there won't actually do that properly. So inbound call stats and information are frequently wrong on gateways because we have no way of knowing that that inbound call is tied to that gateway registration because of the other side doing evil things.
So what's an example of that? Like what would be a bad user agent?
Honestly, FreeSWITCH could do this too if configured in a certain way. So many things. Like I said, we send a specifically crafted username and parameters in the contact params. What I typically see is things not sending the contact params back in the request. That's a required thing. But also you see people overwriting the user portion.
Yeah, a lot of people overwrite the contact.
So neither of which you're supposed to do. You're supposed to send the request URI to the contact from your reg, but people manipulate those for all kinds of reasons and different understandings of the RFC. And
so this is typically essentially called an ALG, right?
I mean, ALGs sometimes, but also just people trying to handle NAT and trying to handle multiple DIDs and things like that will manipulate things.
All right, cool. So, Mirko asks, or Mr. Kiko asks on IRC, how does stun work? Mike, how does stun work?
How does stun work? You have a stun server that sits out somewhere on the internet, typically running on a couple different IPs. And we send out a packet to that stun server, and that packet basically says, hey, I want to know my address. And the stun server receives that packet, and it knows what IP and what port that packet came from because the IP stack says that. And it replies to that packet with, this is the address I got you from. And typically in a stun back and forth, it would then send the same thing from the same IP import on the client to the other IP of the server, and see if it gets the same result. And that'll tell it what kind of NAT it has and what the NAT mappings are.
And we see the NAT mappings in the SDP and everything, right?
Yes.
So
that's why we're doing stun lookups we're doing stun lookups to figure out what our local address is so we can put the right things into our SDP. Now there's this other thing, and WebRTC uses these features of something called ICE, which is kind of part of stun, or it uses stun. ICE does stun stuff, but on the same ports as it's trying to use for media. So each side exchanges candidates in the signaling. It says, this is where I think I am. And then the client and the server send to all of those things saying, hey, I'm here. And it tries to figure out where they can connect to. And that essentially leverages stun-like things, but to the same ports that it's actually going to do media on, which, and then just tries them all. And it's kind of the real time doing the stun things in line with it to tell it that this is indeed a good candidate to communicate on. And that is going to be a working media path for this call. So it's the top of the kind of NAT busting techniques out there, ICE, and that's why WebRTC leverages it along with some encryption features called DTLS on top of that.
And so, like, we look at the popular stun servers, and they also incorporate turn. How does turn tie into this?
So sometimes your client and your server are both behind NATs that are bad enough that they can't talk to each other. So if you're trying to do point-to-point things, that's sometimes required to have a relay server that's not behind NAT somewhere on the public internet. And the other thing that, and turn is that server. And the other thing that turns can handle that FreeSWITCH can't handle natively is TCP audio streams. So all of our audio streams are RTP. It's UDP based. Sometimes it is necessary and required. To some places just have all UDP blocked. So you may want to run your audio over port 443, like HTTPS, TCP. So to do something like that, you generally use a turn server. You'd relay through that turn server on TCP, and it takes in the TCP audio stream and sends out a UDP RTP audio stream out the other side. It's not a great solution. TCP audio is never a great solution. That's why audio is always done over UDP, but sometimes it is the only solution that you have out there. So it can fix the last kind of 3 to 5% of NAT issues that nothing else will fix. Generally, if you're doing a client server kind of architecture and not a point-to-point architecture, generally having your server out there not behind NAT is enough to not need that. And that's true for everything but TCP audio, which happens, but not a lot.
So Verdo actually uses stun query in pretty much every call, right? Or all the signaling. But SIP, I mean, this is something that came in later to SIP.
Verdo is using it for all is using stun or sorry, which
Stun.
Verdo is it's using ICE, so not really stun. The browser is going to be doing ICE negotiation, which does stun kind of inline. It's not going to be using actual stun lookups unless the client's configured to do some of that, and that's mostly related to turn and turn discovery.
And so what's really interesting is if you look at the inspector when you're using it, you always see all the candidates, the ICE candidates and everything. It's always been really cool watching that.
You mean in the browser? Yeah, you absolutely will. You were asking about Verdo versus SIP. This part of it, like the ICE part of it, is not specific to any signaling protocol. So those things will work just as well on SIP and Verdo. It's the exact same media stack. Some of how we do the discovery and configuration of that is module specific on the server side, but the actual media stack itself is 100% shared. It's the same code. So those features will work 100%. Regardless if it's SIP or WebRTC Verdo. And in fact, you can use those same features not WebRTC as well. Like some soft clients support ICE without DTLS. So you can use ICE as a NAT traversal method separate from WebRTC as well. I think Counterpath's latest products have full ICE support. There's others out there as well.
So when should we use something like this as opposed to like connectile dysfunctions?
This stuff is newer and is much preferred. Having the protocol be able to figure out all these NAT issues for you kind of inherently is much preferred to dirty hacks that may break other kinds of devices. I'd say if you can't properly configure your device because your device is mobile or unpredictable network configurations, ICE is probably the solution. That's why WebRTC uses it, is just to make it work all the time. There's little reason not to use it other than it can add a little bit to call startup.
Because it's got to make the call.
Well, it's got to figure out the candidates. So I wouldn't use it like, as a, two known static endpoints. There's no reason to add that. So like carriers talking to each other, there's no reason for that. Those should be, pre-configured IPs that are, stable and not moving. But anything where you're talking to transient things, ICE is a great functionality to avoid all those weird kind of configuration issues. Certainly, talking to end clients, individual end clients should be using it at this point.
So what's really interesting is I was talking to someone on the phone yesterday, And so there haven't been, at least to my knowledge, there haven't been any phones that really implement RTC, right? And so it's going to be the first company out there to really kind of implement the RTC. Like, you could put these phones at any price point because, it basically just eliminates all the NAT issues that could potentially occur, right?
Yes.
So how come nobody's done it?
I can't answer this question.
we got to mention it on some of these calls with the hardware manufacturers.
What else we got?
I think we have one more question left. Let's see.
Awesome.
Okay, so this question is from Justin Gantuis. To load balance traffic across multiple FreeSWITCHes, can I use NuGi? Each FreeSWITCH is on its own install.
I have no idea.
So this kind of, I don't, I Googled it too. I couldn't find anything on it. Okay. So let's change this question is, how do we load balance? What are our options?
Load balancing. SIP load balancing, just use a proxy. There are good open source proxies out there. We are friends with the people who write them. They write great stuff. There is Comma Elio. There's OpenSIPs. They are the top of the line product for this. They are great at what they do. They have tons of functionality. If you want to SIP load balance, you should be using one of them. Hands down, no conversation. The way it should be. They have the functionality to load balance based on metrics and all of these things, and it's what you need to do the job right. As far as Verdo, we never really built a load balancing method into.
You can still use the proxies too.
You can use a WebSocket proxy, but it doesn't have any idea of metrics or things like that. So you can also just use DNS load balancing. What we are doing to solve this problem is we are working on some new things on the SignalWire cloud side that are going to allow you to use something Verdo-like that can scale across our cloud, and we are handling the load balancing on that. So there's some new things coming soon to do that. The current possibilities on load balancing Verdo are kind of imperfect. There are definitely ways you can do it. You have to WebSocket proxy or DNS load balance across multiple endpoints. We have the new things coming out to solve those problems now.
So it's really cool. The OpenSIPs guys wrote for SIP. They wrote this as part of the dispatcher module. It'll actually dispatch based on an algorithm which was generated it connects to event socket and will distribute based on CPU load.
That's kind of cool.
Okay, so thank you for coming in today. Thank you for answering all the questions.
Not a problem. Oh dear God, it's
yeah, we made it. Answers from the experts. And back to you, Ken. Happy New Year's, everybody.
Happy New Year.
All right, guys. Michael Malverudas, Mike Jarris, thank you guys so much for answering all these crazy questions today. Everybody else, have a happy New Year. And we'll be back here on ClueCon Weekly next week. Watch for the announcement on who's going to be joining us then. If you have any ideas for suggestions of people that you would like to see on ClueCon Weekly, please drop an email over to Sharon@freeswitch.com and let her know so we can get people scheduled in here, or contact Madison or myself, or even Mr. Mavrutis and the various social networking things, and we'll see what we can do to get people in here. If you have questions that you would like to get answered from guys like Mike Jarrett or Brian West or even Anthony on Community Corner, be sure you put those on the mailing list. Ask on the SignalWire, on the FreeSWITCH or the SignalWire Slack channels, and we can see about getting those in here also. Anyway, you guys have a great week and great new year, and we'll see you back here next week.
You've been watching ClueCon Weekly. Tune in every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Central. Keep up with the latest happenings by subscribing to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit us at FreeSWITCH.com.